What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. This week we're going to be talking about one of my favourite books ever. I would say it's definitely in my top 3. It's called Just Kids and it was written by the poet and rock star Patti Smith. And you know what, I'm feeling a little bit fancy this week, so we are going to start this video with a quote. But secretly, I knew I had been transformed, moved by the revelation that human beings create art, that to be an artist was to see what others could not. So Just Kids is basically about Patti Smith's life in the late 60s and early 70s, and it's about her relationship with the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, and it's just about their life being young, broke artists in New York City in the 60s and 70s. It's very beautiful, kind of gritty, and you just kind of flow through the book in a really nice, poetic way. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 3 things. What the book's about, why the book changed my life, and how the book changed the way that I think about art. In that order. And you know what? Timestamps. I've figured out how to do timestamps, so we're going to put some of those down here. So, let's start with what's the book about. In Just Kids, Patti Smith writes about her life as a poet in the 70s and 60s in New York City, and about her relationship with the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe. It's a very romanticized portrait of 2 young broke artists trying to make ends meet and encountering some of the most important cultural figures of their time. Just to give you some context, Patti Smith was a famous rock star in the 70s and 80s, and she was a poet. She's super cool. Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer, best known for his black and white pictures of the gay BDSM scene in New York in the 80s. He's also super cool. The book focuses a lot on Patti and Robert's intimate relationship, on Robert's changing sexuality, on both Patti and Robert's rise to fame, and on Robert's tragic death from AIDS in the late 80s. The book romanticizes what it means to be an artist without glamorizing it. Patti describes not having enough money for food, living in cold and damp accommodation, and being homeless for periods of time. But at the same time, she captures the meaningfulness of art, the importance of art and poetry, and she poeticizes her life and Robert's life in a way that's just great. There's no specific reason why this book is good or important. There's no bullet point, this is what this book did that's so important. It's just very, very beautiful and poetic. And in order to prove that, I'm going to give you a short reading from the beginning of the book. Much has been said about Robert, and more will be added. Young men will adopt his gait. Young girls will wear white dresses and mourn his curls. He will be condemned and adored, his excesses damned and romanticized. In the end, truth will be found in his work, the corporeal body of the artist. It will not fall away. Man cannot judge it, for art sings of God and ultimately belongs to him. So basically, I love this book because it romanticizes art and what it means to be an artist. I first read the book when I was about 16 years old, and it had a really big impact on me. I just reread the book, and I'm now 28. What I've noticed is that I picked up on a lot of things as a teenager. There was a lot of things which I didn't quite pick up on as well. For example, I could really see the romanticized, kind of glamorized, heroic idea of these artists living broke lives in New York. But I wasn't picking up on the fact that a lot of the book is just about poverty and about the threat of homelessness and about the absolutely awful consequences of the AIDS crisis on a generation of gay people and artists in that time. All of that, I was a bit too young to pick up on it, but I picked up on it now. So there was a kind of more heavy, gritty side of the book, which I just don't think I was ready to understand as a teenager, but now as an adult, I can take that in. And so I'm quite grateful that I reread the book because it's given me another layer of context to understand the book rather than just understanding it through this rose-tinted lens of blah, 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 artists, poetry, whatever. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there as well. Right, so I'm going to explain to you how this book changed my life. I first came across this book when I was about 16 or 17 years old, And I was in school and it was assembly. And I remember that it was like World Book Day. And one of the teachers had asked like students to recommend books that they really liked. And I remember that one of the cooler kind of A-level art students recommended this book called Just Kids by Patti Smith. And I remember seeing the front cover on like the projector during assembly. And I don't think anyone explained what the book was actually about, but I saw the front cover, I saw the two people, Robert and Patti, the hairstyles, the way they were dressed, the title, and for some reason it just attracted me. I'm not sure what it was about that. But I went away from that assembly. It might have also been the fact that someone who I perceived as quite cool and a bit older than me and an art student was recommending it. So like that makes it seem really cool. So anyway, I went away and bought the book and read it. And what I was picking up on, what I did get from the book at that time, was just the kind of romantic, really important, really poetic and meaningful life of being an artist, what it means to be an artist, to explore yourself through art and to play that role within society of being an artist or a poet. That was really powerful to me at the time. And I started to realize this is something that I really want. Like, as a teenager, I was creative and I enjoyed art and visual learning, but I didn't have a particularly deep connection to visual arts or contemporary art yet. And I think what this book was able to do for me was just push me a little bit further in that direction, because I could have also fallen down the path of graphic design. And I know that my parents would have actually quite liked it if I'd done graphic design because it was a more stable option. But I think this book just gave me that little nudge to be like, actually, I want to study art. I want to go to art school. I want to be an artist. And I'm grateful for that, because I'm not saying it was the only factor. I think there were other factors, and I may still have studied art if it wasn't for this book. But it certainly was in my head at that time. It was influencing me, and I'm grateful for that. It may have helped me make the right decision there. Can you imagine if I was just some corporate graphic designer now? Like, where would be the poetry in that? That would suck. Now we're going to talk about how this book changed the way I think about art. I love this book because it romanticizes and it poeticizes art and the role of the artist. And when I read the book, that makes total sense. Art is a very poetic and romantic subject, so it should be spoken about in a poetic way. Let me give you a quick example. This is from a letter that Robert wrote to Patti sometime in the 70s. I'm just reading you two sentences. I stand naked when I draw. God holds my hand and we sing together. Don't know about you, but I think that's kind of beautiful. So I used to think about art in a very poetic and romantic way. I used to be a painter, believe it or not. And at some point down the line, I stopped thinking about art in a poetic way and started thinking about art in a much more kind of rational, logical, kind of over-intellectual way. And I'm thinking back and I'm trying to understand like when that change happened and why. And I think what happened is I got into art school and I was immersed in the world of contemporary art, which is different to painting and has a different culture and a different set of conversations. But I was also introduced to the world of crits and crit culture. And if you don't know, an art school crit is where you come to a group of peers and you say, I made this thing. And then your group of peers will just savagely tear it apart. They'll tell you all the reasons it's rubbish. They'll ask you all these really hard questions and they'll prove that your artwork makes no sense or isn't good in some way. And as a direct result of that, everyone becomes quite defensive because they've got to defend what they've made. And it's very hard to be defensive about something which is a bit woo-woo or a bit like poetic or romantic. Like, it's much easier to use like intellectual arguments or just very rational kind of like 1 + 1 = 2 arguments, because no one can argue with that. Like, imagine if Robert Mapplethorpe was at CSM and he was in a crit and he went, I stand naked when I draw, God holds my hand and we sing together. Some second year like video artist to be like, what do you mean you hold God's hand? What hand? How does that work? Like, and just make him look like an idiot. And so in a way, I think we all learnt to get very defensive, very over-intellectual, and a bit rational about the way we talk and argue about art, because it makes it more like bulletproof. We can't be mocked. We can't be shown up for like not understanding or like doing something that's just a bit kind of mad. And I think that's fine. And I think it's good, because otherwise, like, my God, our brains would just be in a different planet. We'd be so pretentious. It'd be a nightmare. But at the same time, at least I lost touch with the poetic, because I was trying so hard to create these bulletproof artworks that couldn't be criticized, and when they were criticized, I had direct comebacks to what people were saying. And, you know, there's good and bad there, but something was lost. And I think that's when the way I talked about art changed, because you're very vulnerable and you have to fight back. And poetry is not a great weapon in that fight. I don't know. So anyway, reading Patti Smith and reading the way she talks about art and the way she explores artistic ideas and talks about being an artist, it is poetic, it is romantic, it does make sense. Sure, some over-intellectual, like, idiot could just rip it apart and kind of mock her for it. There's a vulnerability there, but Patti Smith is accessing something and talking about art in such a great, lovely, beautiful way, the way she has to risk looking a bit crazy or looking a bit vulnerable or like even being cringe. She has to do that to talk about art in this way. And honestly, I think, like, yes, art is poetic and art is romantic, and it should be spoken about in that way. Like, the way Patti Smith writes about art is just so beautiful. And that makes me want to think about art and write about art in a more romanticized and poetic way, because, like, honestly, who cares if some smart guy on the internet writes some witty comebacks at me? Like, we can take that, but what is the point of art if we're just going to over-rationalize it and over-intellectualize it anyway? It just becomes a game of who can outsmart who. And I don't think that is art reaching its full potential. So yeah, rereading Patti Smith has helped me to realize that over-intellectualizing things or over-rationalizing things is actually a trap. And it's a trap that I've fallen in the past. Because art is not logical or rational. It's an illogical subject, and it needs to be spoken about in an illogical, irrational, poetic way. So we've created a culture where we're afraid to talk about art on its own terms. And that's something I'd like to move away from in the future. And I'm grateful to Patti Smith for helping me realize this. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. That became a bit of a rant at the end. I hope it made sense. If you've got any books you want me to review, hit it down below. If you've read the book and had opinions about it, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video till the end. Love you guys.